The world is full of riches and more than enough resources for every human being to live with dignity. But unfortunately, this is not the reality for millions of people around the globe. Today, Bello Mundo is going to take you to a bleak and desolate scenario, the poorest countries on the planet. And get ready, because you're going to discover the harsh reality of those who earn less per day than you spend on a single cup of coffee. Number 15, Mali. We'll be traveling to Mali in West Africa, a country that, despite its immense challenges, has a breathtaking history and culture. Home to Timbuktu, the legendary city that was once a world-renowned intellectual and commercial center, Mali still keeps centuries-old traditions alive. Its economic hopes are strongly linked to the areas irrigated by the Niger River, the third largest river in Africa, where 80% of the population depends on agriculture and fishing to survive. But here begins the problem. With 65% of the territory being desert or semi-desert, there is little space left for planting and, to make matters worse, the country is very vulnerable to climate change and price fluctuations on the global market, especially for cotton, its main export product. To survive, the country depends on foreign aid, while violent conflicts in the north and central regions only worsen the chaos. GDP per capita, only $880, a figure that reveals the brutality of the economic crisis ravaging the country. Number 14, Burkina Faso. Still in West Africa, our next destination is Burkina Faso, where the economic challenges are just as overwhelming as those of its neighbor, Mali. Despite being known for its vibrant traditional music and FESPACO, one of the most important film festivals on the entire African continent, this country's cultural richness contrasts sharply with its harsh economic reality. With a GDP per capita of just $870, the local population struggles to survive, depending almost exclusively on subsistence farming. Cotton is the main source of income, but agricultural production suffers from long periods of drought and poor infrastructure, which make life even more challenging. And you know that saying that there's nothing that can't be made worse? That's right. In recent years, the situation in Burkina Faso has been drastically aggravated by political instability and devastating attacks by extremist groups, which have forced thousands of people from their homes. This chaos has only intensified food insecurity and the lack of basic services, such as health and education, plunging the country further into an endless crisis. Number 13, Liberia. Continuing our journey across the African continent, we arrived in Liberia, another nation facing enormous challenges. Known for being Africa's first independent republic, this country has strong ties with the United States, which influence its culture and lifestyle to this day. Proof of this is its flag, which is practically a replica of the American flag. Despite this historical heritage, Liberia's economic reality is quite different from that of the United States. While the GDP per capita of the Americans is around $77,000, in Liberia, the GDP per capita is only $808. This huge difference is the result of decades of instability, including years of civil war and the devastating Ebola epidemic, which destroyed much of the infrastructure and left the economy in ruins. During the Ebola outbreak, the country was one of the worst affected, with thousands of deaths. The health system, already precarious, couldn't cope with the demand, and sectors such as commerce and agriculture came to a standstill. The impact was so severe that the country is still struggling to rebuild its economic and social foundations. Number 12, Somalia. In 12th place on the list of poor countries is Somalia, a country facing major economic and social challenges. Known for its political instability and decades-long conflicts, Somalia is still trying to get back on its feet after years of civil war, severe droughts, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, the GDP per capita is around $727.70, making the country one of the poorest in the world. The economy depends heavily on financial aid sent by Somalis living outside the country, as well as livestock exports and subsistence farming. To complicate matters further, the constant threat of armed conflict with extremist groups such as Al-Shabaab means that the population has difficulty accessing basic services such as health and education. It is estimated that 55% of the population lives below the poverty line, with little hope of improvement in the short term. Number 11. Democratic Republic of Congo. Now we come to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a huge country with soil rich in copper, diamonds, gold, and cobalt. Even with all this potential, the population faces serious challenges on a daily basis. After decades of civil wars and conflicts that have killed millions of people, the country still suffers from political instability and corruption, which hinders progress. Around 73% of the population lives below the poverty line, surviving on less than $2 a day, amounting to around $670 a year per person. Although the mining sector is a major source of income, this is not reflected in the lives of the majority. Around 80% of the population works in subsistence agriculture, but due to the lack of infrastructure, only 10% of arable land is cultivated. Number 10. Mozambique. In our 10th position, we now come to Mozambique. Despite having vast reserves of natural gas and minerals, life there is far from easy for most people. With a GDP per capita of approximately $630, Mozambique has faced many challenges in transforming its wealth into improvements for the people. Although the economy has grown with the exploitation of gas in the South Coral Field, the truth is that this wealth still doesn't reach the majority of Mozambicans. And the reasons? Oh, there are several. In fact, it's a combination of factors: armed conflicts in the north of the country, corruption, and the threat of terrorism, especially in the Cabo Delgado region, which has been suffering from attacks by extremist groups since 2017. This not only directly affects local communities, but also delays the development of essential infrastructure. In addition, corruption remains a serious problem, preventing investments from reaching where they are most needed. Number 9. Niger. Leaving Mozambique, our destination now is Niger, another country facing huge challenges despite its natural wealth, such as uranium and oil. With a GDP per capita of around $610, most of Niger's economy depends on agriculture, which accounts for 40% of GDP. However, this sector is often hampered by droughts, pests, and poor soil, which makes the situation even worse. What's more, in 2013, the country was the target of economic sanctions and border closures due to a military coup, which caused food prices to skyrocket and led to a liquidity crisis in the banking sector, which in other words means that the banks didn't have enough money to carry out transactions and meet the needs of the population. Not to mention that food insecurity affects around 2,300,000 people, and armed conflicts in various regions, coupled with the presence of extremist groups, further complicate the lives of millions of inhabitants. Number 8. Malawi. Our journey now takes us to Malawi, a landlocked country in southern Africa, famous for its stunning landscapes and the iconic Lake Malawi, the ninth largest lake in the world, a vital source of crystal-clear fresh water. But behind all this beauty, Malawi's economic reality is far less attractive. With a GDP per capita of around $570, the country faces huge challenges in improving the quality of life of its population. More than 80% of people depend on agriculture to survive, but this economic base is constantly threatened by climatic shocks, such as droughts and cyclones, which destroy crops and deepen the crisis. And to make matters worse, there are no signs that this harsh reality is going to change any time soon. As a result, 72% of the population continues to live on less than $2 a day. Number 7. Yemen. And while we're on the subject of the struggle to survive on less than $2 a day, our next destination is Yemen, a country ravaged by armed conflict and the scene of one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. With a GDP per capita of just $540, Yemen is the portrait of a nation torn apart by years of civil war that have destroyed its economy and infrastructure, turning the lives of millions into a constant nightmare. Since the conflict between the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels began in 2014, the destruction has not let up. Millions of people have been left without access to basic services such as water, food, and health, while around 80% of the population is desperately dependent on humanitarian aid to survive. And the tragedy doesn't stop there. Chronic hunger punishes a large part of the country, with a staggering 2,200,000 children suffering from acute malnutrition. The agricultural sector, which once sustained much of the economy, is in ruins, and unemployment has reached alarming levels. To complete the horror scenario, the health system has collapsed, destroyed by incessant bombing and a lack of resources. What remains for the Yemenis is a daily struggle against a chaos that seems to have no end. Number 6. Sudan. We come to Sudan, a country which, despite its abundance of natural resources, such as oil and gold, faces an absolutely disastrous economic and social reality. With a GDP per capita of just $530, the situation in Sudan is even tougher than the figures might show. In recent years, the country has been ravaged by violent conflicts between the armed forces and paramilitary groups, which have intensified brutally since 2023. These clashes have not only paralyzed the economy, but also plunged the country into an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, leaving millions in extreme poverty and dependent on aid to survive. As if that weren't enough, the war has forced more than 4 million Sudanese to abandon their homes, turning them into refugees in their own land. Food insecurity now haunts the country, putting 17,700,000 people on the brink of starvation. Number 5. Madagascar. Coming in at number 5 on our list, we land in Madagascar, that country that many people know from the movie full of amusing animals, such as lemurs. But outside the big screen, the reality of the island is quite different. Madagascar is famous for its unique biodiversity, home to species that exist nowhere else on the planet. But for the local population, life is far from a colorful animation. With a GDP per capita of just $529, around 80% of the population can barely make ends meet, living on just over $2 a day. For many, existence boils down to a daily struggle against extreme poverty. Madagascar's biggest nightmare is food insecurity. Devastating cyclones and constant droughts have turned the lives of millions into a real battleground for food. Today, around 1 million people in the country face conditions of extreme hunger, being forced to consume even cacti to survive. Number 4. Central African Republic. Our next destination is virtually unknown, and chances are you've never heard of it. Somewhere forgotten in Africa, there is a nation called the Central African Republic. Unfortunately, more unknown than its name is the tragic reality of this country, which is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, a crisis that kills in anonymity, far from the world spotlight. Like the other countries on this list, the Central African Republic is incredibly rich in resources such as diamonds, gold, and timber. However, the population does not benefit from this wealth. This is because the Central African Republic has been mired in armed conflict and political instability for decades. With a GDP per capita of around $460, more than 70% of the population lives in extreme poverty. To make matters worse, 90% of people have no access to electricity, and the country's basic infrastructure is practically non-existent. Number 3. South Sudan. In our top 3, we find South Sudan, the youngest country in the world. With only 12 years of independence, the future seemed full of hope, promising peace and prosperity. But that promise quickly gave way to a grim reality. Since its independence in 2011, South Sudan has faced a series of crises, border conflicts, oil disputes, and violent tribal fighting. What should have been a new beginning has turned into an ongoing nightmare, made worse by the complete lack of infrastructure and basic services. With a population of almost 11 million people, more than half of whom are young people under the age of 30, South Sudan has a GDP per capita of just $480. But the most frightening thing is that 90% of this population lives in extreme poverty, with no prospect of a decent life. And as if that weren't tragic enough, infant mortality in the country is devastating. 1 in 7 children dies before reaching the age of 1. Number 2. Sierra Leone. Now we land in Sierra Leone, a country which, unfortunately, is better known for its economic and social challenges than for its natural beauty. Famous for its diamonds, which you may have heard of, the country also faced one of Africa's most devastating civil wars, a harsh reality portrayed in the Hollywood production Blood Diamonds, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, which depicts diamond mining during the Civil War in the 1990s. If this turbulent past wasn't enough, the country, like Liberia, faced the Ebola outbreak between 2014 and 2016, which only worsened the situation. Today, the country's GDP per capita is around $460. In other words, a father of a family receives the equivalent of a cup of coffee from the bakery every day. Number 1. Burundi. At the top of the poverty podium is Burundi, a small East African country facing huge challenges after being devastated by a civil war that left deep scars on the nation. Although it has fertile land, more than 80% of Burundi's population depends on agriculture to survive, an activity that is constantly sabotaged by climatic problems and a lack of infrastructure. With a GDP per capita of a mere $320, Burundi stands out as one of the poorest countries in the world. More than 70% of the population survives on less than $1 a day, a brutal reality that makes basic necessities such as food and health practically inaccessible. To give you an idea, life expectancy in the country is just 50 years, and a staggering 75% of the population is undernourished. And as if that weren't enough, The country is still desperately dependent on foreign aid to sustain essential areas, sinking deeper and deeper into a cycle of poverty and dependency that seems to have no end. Now it's up to you. What did you think of this list? Were you surprised by any of the countries that appeared? If you know any other stories or curiosities about these places, share them with us in the comments. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way, you'll be up to date with all the videos and curiosities we bring you about our Bello Mundo. To those of you who have watched this far, thank you very much, and see you next time.